Welcome today, everybody. Well, hello and beautiful people. This is the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. As always, we talk about how things in Montpelier shake out for the rest of us. So glad you can be joining us today. I don't remember if I said, I'm Olga Peters. I am your host, and I'm speaking today with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who is one of 3 reps for the town of Brattleboro. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Olga.
And welcome today, first time to the show, and we hope it's not the last, Paul Dragon, who is the executive director of the Champlain Valley Office of Economic Opportunity, also known as CVOEO. And it is one of 5 community action agencies in the state that were started. I find this really interesting, Paul. They actually were part of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty from 1964, kind of launched these organizations. But what you often say about the work you do is you've often described it as fighting with one hand tied behind your back, because while you are trying to do one thing to help people live better, more fulfilling, thriving lives, and especially economic lives, you often feel that the systems you're trying to do this in don't work or don't support that work. Could you dive into that? Just like right off the top, can you dive into that for us?
First of all, Olga, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Emily. I really appreciate it, and thanks for all you do. Yeah, I have described our work at times as, fighting poverty with one hand tied behind our back, because, we have deep systemic issues in this country. And it is hard for any single agency, whether it's a community action agency or another nonprofit working on issues of homelessness or food access, to really solve the issue of poverty when there are so many deep systemic issues that really arise from, I think a capitalism that's gone kind of wrong, and it could be a different kind of democratic capitalism where there's still that kind of competition, but we need more economic security for people in this country. So we're not going to be able to solve all the issues as community action agencies if we don't have affordable housing, we don't have affordable health care, we don't have higher wages for people, if childcare costs are through the roof, and if we don't have affordable higher education. All these things are really, really important in terms of equity and lifting people out of poverty. And I would add a conversation that we're all getting into right now, and that is access to technology, because that's a disparity issue economically, racially, for all marginalized populations. So access to technology and broadband so people could connect with their medical home, especially in a very rural state like Vermont. So our Head Start kids, we have 200 something Head Start families around our area, so they can connect in terms of education. All these things are really, really important. So yes, we do great work. A lot of nonprofits are doing really important work, connecting people to services, helping to lift them out of poverty. I think what the pandemic showed, however, is you can have this great infusion of money that really can help. And it's just like the child tax care credit. If they are short-term and not permanent changes, then we're going back to where we were pre-pandemic, and we're going to have the same issue where we're kind of treading water. We're working hard with people. Some people are succeeding. Some communities are succeeding. But again, without these deep systemic issues, we're not going to be able to, get the majority of people out of poverty. And the poverty rate in this country and in Vermont for both adults and children is way too high, and it's not sustainable. And the last thing I'll just say, when you put in these systemic changes, affordable health care, education, higher wages, better child care supports, that lifts everybody. That raises everybody, not just people with lower incomes, and it helps drive the economy. And I have hopes that some of the stimulus package that will be coming through will help do that and be more permanent. But even the child tax credit is only going to be for 1 year right now, and that's estimated to lift, half of the children out of poverty. And just one caveat when we talk about the poverty level, that is a very old calculation, and that is a very low threshold, as you probably know. You could go up to 200% of the poverty level, and you will see people still mightily struggling. Poverty level is an artifact from the 1950s that we haven't been able to really change. And yes, the Economic Opportunity Act, Lyndon Johnson, 1964, the War on Poverty. It included all the community action agencies. There's 5 in Vermont, 1,000 across the country. It also started Head Start, Vista, the Peace Corps, and a number of other remarkable programs that are doing good work. We do need the structural changes, however, to really alleviate poverty in this country, in my opinion.
Paul, there's so many threads there that I want to pull from. And so 2 that I'm thinking of are just to highlight what you said about the stability, and that with the child care tax credits, if I know I'm getting just this one-time check, I'm going to make very different decisions about my life with that money than I would if I know that it was consistently coming in and it was something that I could depend on to maybe supplement my income so I could let go of a second job and spend more time with my kids, or take an extra class to get another degree to get more money long-term, or whatever it is. But know that stability is a very different thing. And I think some of the housing that we were able to provide during the pandemic really took us one step closer to a lot of Vermonters being able to feel that stability that was solid enough to start planning from. And I hold a lot of heartbreak that we haven't figured out how to sustain that, or that we haven't sustained that. I think we figured out how to sustain it. It's just money. And so that's one thing I want to spend a lot of time talking about today. But before we do that, I think it's important for listeners to hear about sort of the career that you had before you were at CVOEO, that you have sort of spent time in different parts of the system, and that you spent a lot of time at the Office of Economic Opportunity, at the Agency of Human Services. And I'm sort of curious about what it's like being sort of a little bit outside of the machine and being inside the machine, and if you see the problems a little differently from that vantage point. Because I'm going to just keep on extending my sentences too. Because I think the hope of the War on Poverty and the community actions when they started was really about walking alongside folks who were struggling. It was really about a movement that was led by poor people and for poor people, rather than continuing the charity mechanisms that help the most vulnerable. And so I don't think that's necessarily how most of our community actions operate nationally anymore. But I think there's still some mechanisms in there that we can pull threads from and build on into the future to really have Vermont work better for each of us and have people really like leading their own lives.
Emily, I think I want to take up your last piece first, because I think that's much more important than my boring biography. So the way the community action agencies, it was a radical notion at the time, as you suggest, in the 60s, for community action agencies when they were incorporated. The idea was that low-income people would be in charge of their communities. They would make decisions about the funding. So some of that legacy is still alive here, right? We have on our board of directors, in every community action agency who gets community services block grant funding has to have on their board of directors representation from the low-income community. So we have 12 board of directors. We have 4 people that represent the low-income community who have received services before. So I think that's important. Our Head Start program, our Head Start Policy Council is made up of families who are all in Head Start or connected to Head Start or have received Head Start. So in that way, and they're able to help Head Start directors and our organization as a whole, CVOEO, make decisions. So that's important. Now, I do think community action agencies, even with those levers in terms of our decision-making processes, have lost have lost that vibrancy and that connection to the community in many ways. And it is something now, I've been on a year here during the pandemic, post-pandemic, I think at least CVOEO wants to get back to, and I think we all should really get back to, because it is really, I see community action as not just anti-poverty and not just community development, but community organizing. So for instance, here, when you look at some of the programs that we have that a lot of community action agencies don't have, they're based on advocacy. So we have resident organizers going into mobile home parks around the state, working with mobile home residents who you know are some of the most vulnerable residents because of the quality of the stock, because of effects of climate change on mobile home parks and where they're located. So they work with them very, very closely. And I've been on Zoom meetings since I've been here, seeing this in action, trying to lift up people's voices so they can organize their lives and hopefully make better decisions and maybe even take control of that mobile home park. So that's an important piece. Plus we have fair housing and Vermont tenants, and we do the same thing working with residents all over the state to make that happen. I don't think we do that enough in our other programs necessarily, but we do have those three programs. You know, we just went through a strategic planning process here where we had a Holiday Inn resident guest that probably had one of the strongest voices in our strategic planning process. Now that was just one person out of 21. We had staff and some community members. Her voice was critical to the way we thought about our strategic planning. So the point is, going forward, I know we as CVOEO and I think community action agencies across the country do this in varying degrees, but we all have got to recommit to making sure, in your words, we're working side by side with people and actually having people lead us in the process, because it is their community and we're just part of the community just like them. So I think that's a really great point. And I have noticed that, Emily, I think we have lost that thread, that radical notion that a lot of people disagreed with at the time. You can't just give this money to the communities and let communities decide. It has become much more organizational, top down, the organization saying this is how we're going to fund it rather than the community. So I agree, we need to do a much better job there.
And I think a lot of that is how the federal funds and the state funds are delivered and monitored. So I think there's a lot we can do on the state level, if not on the national level, to put those decisions back in the hands of people.
I agree.
So the Holiday Inn, you mentioned that, the resident, I think there was a article in 7 Days today, which, with due respect to the reporter, had like one of the most obvious headlines I've seen in a while, which was essentially, wages don't match the cost of housing in Vermont. And, you know, so true, something we talk about all the time. I certainly have colleagues who still don't seem to be able to integrate that piece of information because it's so different from their lives and their other colleagues' lives. But one of the main reasons we have homelessness is because people don't have the money for housing. And for a while during the pandemic, we found the money to house everyone. And so love to hear from you. We've talked to Josh Davis down here a lot about really the incredible opportunities that Groundwork saw when people were fully housed and services could be integrated and on-site. We had a huge drop in our overdose death rate here during the pandemic, just as one example of something really powerful that happened when people were housed and in community. But would love to hear from you some of the successes and then some of what you see as sort of next steps as we, maybe we could fail up a little bit here.
So I think we learned a lot during the pandemic. So CVOEO had never run a emergency housing facility in the past, and the state asked us to do it. And it did become we operated the Holiday Inn. So it was the largest emergency shelter in the state. And at one point we had 160 people there. So what I think I learned, and I think, my colleagues and our staff would concur, is that when you give people a respectful setting with their own room, their own bath, access to food, access to services, they tend to do much, much better. And I think one of the things that I learned was what an antiquated shelter system we have had in this state. Because I know from traveling around the state and going into shelters, and this is not the fault of any shelter provider because they are super underfunded. So what happens is they get funded to put people in, congregate settings, and as you know, many often have to leave during the day and they can't come back to the evening, and they're living in these congregate settings that are often, not that trauma informed, quite frankly. And we do know even one brief experience of homelessness can be traumatic for a person and for a family. So I know, one thing that, I learned is that we can't have a shelter system that goes back to that model. People deserve their own space. They deserve a trauma-informed space where they can do things that they need to do as an individual to seek the things that they want in life. That is very hard to do in a crowded setting where people have to leave during the day. It also just makes more sense knowing that the next public health crisis is probably right around the corner. So I would like to see us do away with the shelter system as we have had it, and at least go towards a single resident occupancy where everybody gets a nice space on their own and some good common places with services on site. And I think the hotels around the state and the providers did that really, really well. Now, California is going through a process of buying out hotels and housing people. They've got a much worse issue. I am sure Vermont could do the same thing. We could at least commit to housing every family and every child, if not every individual. It is completely doable. I would hate us to go back to a congregate shelter setting. I think that's the lowest bar that we could probably avoid. We saw a lot of success at the Holiday Inn in moving people out and into permanent housing. The issue is it's a struggle. Our coordinated entry list, which prioritizes people for homelessness, sometimes there's a two-year wait list for housing. So even if you have a voucher, and there's plenty of vouchers around the state right now, you cannot get into a home because they're all taken. We're running the CARES housing voucher program for the state. We were given 420 vouchers. We've distributed over 200 of them. We've approved the remaining, but those approvals, people are waiting because they can't find apartments, even though they have the subsidy. So these things are interconnected.
And I want to name that having vouchers and not being able to find housing was a problem long before the pandemic. Want to make sure our listeners understand that prior to the eviction moratorium, prior to the public health crisis, prior to the sort of in-migration to Vermont, 5 years ago, even, people had vouchers in at least Windham County and had no opportunities to find housing. And often their vouchers would expire before they could find housing that fit the guidelines and that was safe for them.
Sometimes the vouchers went back to the federal government, which is a real shame. Yeah, I think.
Sorry, could I interrupt quickly, Emily and Paul? And I'm sorry, my neighbor's mowing his lawn. When you talk about guidelines that make it hard for people to use these vouchers, could you just outline for folks what those guidelines are? Because I think a lot of people don't understand the kind of barriers people are bumping into when they're trying to find housing with these vouchers.
So one of them we talked about last week because we talked about the housing registry and housing safety. And so most voucher units need to pass an inspection from the state housing authority. And that's not it's not a fancy inspection. It's very far from a fancy inspection. It's really just will anyone die in the first 3 days or burn in this unit? I mean, it's really they're not, it's not as high a bar as if you're going to host a foster youth. It's not a high bar as like, if you're going to get a mortgage on the property. It's really just like, is this a bare minimum of safety? It's the kind of thing that the safety requirements that we had in the housing bill. And then a landlord needs to be interested in renting to someone who has a voucher, which, pegs someone as poor, and people have lots of judgments about what it means to rent to someone who's poor. It also means that they have a guaranteed source of income for their unit. And so there's a lot of reasons to want to rent to someone who has a voucher. It's a very financially stable option. And then for most of the vouchers, the unit needs to, you're not allowed to pay more than the voucher is for. So it's not that, so the voucher is set at a certain amount of money based on local housing costs that the federal government, I believe, has set. Paul, you're going to correct me a lot at the end.
Yeah, and the state vouchers mirror the federal, but you're right. There's a maximum amount based on the local fair housing market value.
And those are much lower than the actual fair housing. Well, it might be the fair housing market value, but they're far below the actual housing market value in our communities. And renters aren't allowed to make up the difference in them for the most part. And so that's a really challenging piece, because you're asking a landlord to rent below the amount that they could get. And that's one of the places that our housing trusts and other sort of designated affordable housing buildings can really help.
Exactly, Emily. Yep, that was a great description.
And I'm sorry, before I jumped in with my question, Paul, you were about to make a point, and I'm sorry for interrupting you on that.
No, I think the point is that we also don't want to have people. So there's so many layers to this, right? We're housing first. We want everybody to get housing. We believe it's a human right to have, their own place to live. So then you start to think about, okay, well, until then, what are we doing? So we have all these people on the waiting list. Well, let's not go back to an antiquated shelter system. Let's try to build something, even though it's kind of horrible to say, where people are getting their own rooms. These are, hotels that maybe the state could purchase, and people could go in them in a temporary way until they can be moved out. That's worked, I think, quite well over the past year. However, we never want to congregate people who have experienced homelessness in any one place. We want people integrated into our community. So these are all like, we're making bargains with our own ethics and with our own morals that we don't like to do. Yet also we have to think about harm reduction. So for instance, the Holiday Inn closed. We were able to move most people into other hotels or into housing. We had 30 people that had no other option. And, so what did we do? We applied to the state for grants, and we got some funding from Jane's Trust to create an outreach team, which CVOEO has never had before. So now we have a 3-person outreach team that's going to be doing outreach to encampments in different places around Chittenden County to organize food delivery, essential needs, and all these things. But what a horrible place to be in as an organization and as a society, where we had to use that money to bring tents to people, to get food delivery, to, hygiene, all these things. It's something that we didn't want to do. And we were approached by the city is looking for somebody to manage an encampment, a very large encampment here in Burlington. And I mean, that's not something that we would do as an organization. That would be completely against what we talk about in our fair housing program and everything. What we will do is outreach there. And We would do resident organizing, just like we do at the mobile home park, to have people lift up their voice and advocate for themselves in these encampments. But to think that's where we are, we're constantly peeling the onion away to get at like these most fundamental things where, and we're wasting a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of energy on this.
And we're also wasting a lot of people's lives and heart. Right?
Yeah. But if you want to generalize it, it would just be better for our whole community. You know, if people were better integrated rather than doing this. I remember when I was in DC with my youngest daughter, she was 5, she's 22 at the time. She was horrified at all the people that she was seeing living on the streets. She could not understand it, right? So think about like the devastation for the person who has to live on the street. Think about the people who like sit back in our innocence and wonderment at like, what is this disaster before me? Like, why can't we do something for people here? And then think about the economy. Like, why can't we just upfront get people's basic needs taken care of? So there's not all this trauma, there's not all this turmoil, there's not all this waste.
Yeah. The perfect being the enemy of the good is what I'm experiencing a lot with this transition time. We can't build enough permanent housing fast enough for everyone in our community, even people with, including people with salaries and stable credit histories and all of that. Even people who wouldn't be discriminated against can't find the housing they need. We can't build enough housing fast enough for that permanency. And so we're in some ways not doing anything because sort of the purchase of the motels, the single room occupancies, the congregate situations. I don't know if we're scared that if we invest in those, we'll stop there. And so we don't want to go any further. So we just are paralyzed by that, that maybe we know ourselves well enough to say if we do good enough, then we'll stop and not try for better. But in the meantime, we have people who are, sleeping on the side of embankments during, increasingly catastrophic weather situations. And we're spending a huge amount of resources to care for folks. And, a few episodes ago, we talked about wound care and how incredibly complicated that can be when you don't have access to, clean, sterile environments. So yeah, it's sad.
I guess my question would be, how can we put so much money into our healthcare system and there's so much waste and some simple procedures cost so much money, wound care, where if we backed up and really looked at the social determinants of health, housing, food access, hygiene, if you were to take some of that money, which we've all talked about, and put it in those things that really stabilize people's health, including their mental health, why aren't we doing that? Because if we did that, we would save so much money in the healthcare system, and this would be a lot cheaper. This intervention downstream would be a lot cheaper. So it begs the question, why don't we do that? And, I've heard from people like that worked in the hospital system, we rely on a certain amount of people coming into the emergency room so we can continue to make money. And you know all about the extravagant costs of healthcare in our system. I mean, nothing's easy. I can easily say this. However, it is Kafkaesque to think that we can't do better here, and that somebody can't unwind this, and we can't put some of that money into essential needs to get people stabilized so they're not hitting the healthcare system at such expensive costs.
Thank you, Paul. We have to go and hear from some of our underwriters. So the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm your host, Olga Peters, and I am speaking with Representative Emily Kornheiser and Paul Dragon. So glad to have you both back on the show. And Emily, what do we need to remind our listeners?
That the views expressed on this show are those of the hosts and the guest, and not the radio station, not the TV station, not any organizations that anyone here is affiliated with, but just the individuals who are saying the things about things today.
Thank you very much. As always, you can find us on your local community access channel at iTunes and our Facebook page, the Montpelier Happy Hour. And the Montpelier Happy Hour.captivate.fm is our website. So Emily, you asked a really great question during the break, and it was if we are to go forward with making sure people have what they need in their lives. You asked like what's missing. So could you dive back into that question and kind of pull it apart for us?
Yeah. And for those watching on the video, if I seem distracted, it's because I think there's an orphaned fawn outside my window with a messed up eye. And if anyone watching on Facebook knows what I could do to help the poor little baby deer, I'd appreciate a comment to tell me who to call. So onwards. So we've talked about sort of this, the perfect being the enemy of the good. In terms of we don't want to purchase motels because we only want to invest in long-term housing. But in the meantime, we have people sleeping outside. We've talked about how we don't want to have too many folks who have experienced homelessness in one setting, or actually even too many wealthy people in one setting. We know that it's best for communities when they're integrated by income, by racial background, et cetera. We just know that integrated communities are best for society and politics and schools and everything. And we also, I think, are hesitant to invest in temporary solutions when we can invest in long-term solutions. But that all might be true. And in the meantime, we're not doing enough of it. We're not doing it fast enough. And we're leaving people, again, sleeping on the street. So it's not like out to dry, it's out to get wet. And I'm trying to figure out what that is. And so one of my ideas is that enough of us have done this work for long enough that we know that if we got people off the streets in some way, we would stop having urgency around investing in long-term housing. So we might, if we accept one solution, we might not continue on to the better solution. I think there is a lot of community pushback around housing first models. And we still have a really sort of deep New England ethic here of people need to work for what they get. And everyone can figure it out if they try hard enough. And all of, I don't have a very good voice of that in my head. So it's, not very good at practicing it. And there's that piece. And then there's the Vermont, as Paul was saying, with emergency rooms and healthcare and all that, we're not very good at investing in both upstream solutions and downstream solutions simultaneously. Sometimes if something magical happens, we can shift to investing in upstream, but then we'll stop investing in the downstream, or we invest in the downstream and don't want to invest in the upstream because you have to double fund for a while before you save the money. And so I think that's part of it, but I don't know. There has to be something else, because even that doesn't seem enough challenges to keep us from making sure everyone has a bed. So
Paul, what's your response to Emily's question? What do you see missing, or how do you feel the system could move forward better?
I'll take us back to, I think, what Emily started talking about was the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act, War on Poverty, and the promise of community action. I would just reflect that I think one of the areas where we need to improve and renew ourselves, that is with community dialogue. I think that's really important. because as Emily said, there is this notion of people need to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps, and that's deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in our culture. So how do we go back to create community and have the conversation so that people start to understand that when we lift everyone up, when we lift people out of poverty, we lift the whole community up. And that's really important because we're all links in this chain of community. Mario Cuomo, it's an antiquated idea when I'll say it, this idea that he had when he was giving his, I think it was for Bill Clinton, the Democratic Convention nomination. He talked about a communal spirit where, when people moved out to the West, they went out in the West with these pioneer wagons. And one of the things that, one of the promises that was just foundational that they would not break is that you don't leave any wagon behind when it broke down. You always stood together. That was the thing. And, I don't know if we have that so much in the United States to the degree we do. We see people coming together over the pandemic. That's been really, really wonderful. However, I think there is more to do around community understanding about the people that we often leave behind. And that is the LGBTQ community, certainly who suffers much more in terms of poverty and discrimination and negative health effects. Transgender community particularly is hit hard with suicide, mental health, high poverty levels. So how do we start to bring everybody along and get people to believe that when we lift people out of poverty, when we do better for them, we're doing better for the community, and it's good for all of us. And that's a conversation that I think the community action agencies should be, if not leading, to be a very strong part of. We don't do that community organizing as much as we should. CVOEO is about to enter into a project for the next year with the Vermont Folklife Center, where we're going to be documenting and talking about community action, issues of poverty, racism, and environmental injustice. And we'll be talking with our staff and our community and the people that we serve and other stakeholders. And I think it's things like that that can start to begin the conversation of where do we need to be? Like, where are we breaking down in this conversation? Like, why is it better for people to live on the streets from your perspective? Is it simply because they have to make their own way? Well, we all have had different disadvantages or advantages in life, and you don't know what happened to that person. So, some of us just got lucky, right? And so how do we bring everybody along like that caravan? And it's a deep cultural issue in our society. That kind of community spirit, I'm sorry to say, is just not there. And that's the dialogue I think we have to engage our community in. And community action agencies should be doing that.
I'm so excited about this Vermont Folklife Center thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if Evie Lovett, who lives down here in Putney, did this really amazing oral history project going around to the food shelves around the state. I think she did it for the Hunger Council maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So if you can get your hands on that, it was a pretty incredible project. Maybe she did it for the food bank, but it was really very moving and might be a good baseline. And then I think about our mobile home park down here, Mountain Home, and the incredible effects that they're still feeling from Irene, and what powerful environmental justice voices there are in that community. We've been talking about harm reduction on the show, mostly in the context of opioids, but as I've been sort of sitting with the language of harm reduction and sort of backing up from it a little bit to say, sort of big picture, harm reduction means developing policies that mitigate or prevent all of the extra harm of something that happens, right? And it, of course, does not have to be limited to opioids. And I think about that still, though, the language and some of the implications of it is still very much on the individual level, that we're talking about reducing harm for an individual person who is engaging in an activity or in a situation, but community harm reduction seems to be a more useful frame. And that even when we're talking about individual activities or an individual person's choices around harm reduction means reducing harm for the whole community, whether that's reducing costs of that person causing harm, or reducing crime rates, or reducing hospital costs for our a third way to socialized healthcare system, or a third way to socialized education system. And so thinking about housing in the context of reducing harm for the whole community by having everyone housed and stable and with privacy and opportunities to connect with neighbors, that seems like a really powerful opportunity right now for me in terms of framing.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think of it. And I think that's the kind of conversation that we have to normalize that there is a communal trauma, right? We've experienced it during the pandemic. But really, when you think about this pandemic, we've had a pandemic of poverty and hunger and homelessness for so long. And I think on some level, we are traumatized by the inequities in this society. Look at all the things that we've had to do, all the ways that people have had to lift up their voice and to do different things, and then the negative reaction to that. So, I think before the pandemic, we were in a critical health situation with ourselves, both in terms of real health, mental health, and as a community. And I think there's just got to be dialogue around this, and reaching across aisles. That phrase is going to be really, really important, because I don't know what it is. So there are some people living in poverty who think that, everybody else should also lift themselves out of poverty.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand where that independence comes from, because we are all so deeply interconnected. I don't understand it. So yeah, community work needs to happen. Emily, I agree.
When I think about the community-wide trauma that you just said, I think of story of your daughter when she was 5, and sort of seeing like Stark City-like homelessness for the first time. And I think everyone, at least most people I know, have some sort of story like that the first time they saw it, the first time their child saw it. I grew up spending a lot of time in Manhattan, and so I have no memory of the first time I saw it. And it was normalized to me before I even had a framework for thinking about it with horror, and how much, in order to survive the unsurvivable, the unexplainable, we have to shut off these parts of our souls and our hearts. And what trauma that causes, that from the age of 5 or whatever it is, we learn that we have to turn away from so much of the pain in order to make it. And I think in practicing turning off that pain, we become numb to it, and then it just becomes political decisions or economic decisions, and not community decisions.
So well said. And, I asked her, I don't know, it was probably a couple of years ago, if she remembered that, and she said she didn't. And I think that's riveting. But I remember it because she was tugging on my arm saying, do something about this, give him money, and that is a super hard thing to hear, and not to be able to solve, and to tell your kid, you know what, this is bigger than me. This is all of us. I can't solve this. I'm really sorry. And it's a horrible thing. And when the resources are there, if we all pitch in, we can solve this. We can get a lot of this done. It's ridiculous to say that we could never end homelessness or end poverty. That's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. There's an.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I've been talking so much.
One thing I'm hearing, and in this notion of conversations, I find it really interesting how we are so good often at coming together for a crisis. And yet when it comes to the long-term sustainability solutions, we're not always that great at them. And I think Emily mentioned that earlier in the show. And on this notion of community conversations, where do you feel we need to change some of our thinking to be able to, or some of our stories, whatever, to be able to shift from this kind of crisis mode or mentality around helping people to finding systems that actually sustain them long term.
So so growing up in New York, and so much of the poverty really receded to the background. And then I moved to San Francisco for a year, and the folks who sleep on the streets in San Francisco engage with the people who are walking past constantly. And that does not happen at least that did not happen in New York in the 80s. It might happen in New York now. I don't really ever go there anymore. But the folks who slept on the streets absolutely engaged, like, with whoever was sort of the regular people in their neighborhood, and everyone, I mean, there are a lot of problems there when I was there. And I think probably there are a lot less people sleeping on the streets there now because they've been pushed off the streets by the .coms. But there was this constant community exchange, partly because the folks who were sleeping on the streets refused to be silent. And sometimes we're super friendly and sometimes we're super angry, just like all the humans are. And there was a period in Brattleboro a couple of years ago where there was a push to really legislate or create policy that would ban folks who were living on the streets from engaging with people who were walking past. And that's illegal on the federal level. And we all sort of moved through that process as a community. But I think the more places and spaces that are truly public, that we can create opportunities, and I really hate the word empower so much, and I'm about to use it. Folks who have had experiences like this, even if they're in their past, to just speak about their experience, the more we realize that, it's just by sheer force of luck or privilege that such a thing hasn't happened to us, or that, it's just, we all just take care of it. I don't know.
Thank you, Emily. How about you, Paul?
I like that. And I think this closing down of public spaces has been this way to just subvert the notion that we have a lot of poverty and we have a lot of homelessness and we have a lot of hunger. So it's a structural way to just keep it, out of people's gaze. And what we need to do, I think, is a few things. One is fight to open up those public spaces, let people park where they want to park in their car if they have to sleep, and not expect that knock on the window and not live in fear. And then we do, like Emily said, I think we need to tell stories. Stories are very powerful. And it's got to be the story about how we are stronger together as a community and how people feel when they feel shut out. And that's going to be something that's going to be very public, very common, and it should be done through stories. I remember, I was a Peace Corps volunteer when I was just out of college, and I was in a small village in the Manding Mountains in Mali, West Africa, and deeply poor on the borders of the Sahara. But the one thing they committed to is they would take care of each other. They would adopt other kids if the parents died. If they had extra food, they would all share the food. How does that happen there, but it can't happen here? I think we also have a lot to learn from other cultures, and not to think that we're always the best just because we're the richest.
Thank you. We are just about out of time, so I want to throw it to you, Paul. Just any thoughts you want to leave listeners with before we end the show?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you both so much for engaging in these conversations. I think it's wonderful, and I think it does start with these conversations, so I appreciate you both deeply. And I would just say to the listeners that please accept us as a community. Please connect with each other. Please reach out. Please understand that somebody else's misfortune is our collective misfortune.
Thank you. Emily, any thoughts you want to leave listeners with?
That we need to keep on talking about this, and that we can say that some things are unacceptable.
Wonderful. Thank you. Normally, well, I'm just going to leave one little thought before we end the show. I often find these conversations fascinating because, as some may know, in another part of my life, I study feng shui, which a lot of folks think of, oh, it's interior design, but it's deeper than that on many levels. And it's about how do we create balanced, healthy environments for people. And I'm so often fascinated when I hear these conversations around social services or like congregate shelter settings, as an example. I'm always surprised because so often some of our systems that don't work actually don't work on like a feng shui level. Like if I were to look at them as a feng shui practitioner, I'm like, well, why do you think that's going to create a healthy environment? And I just keep coming back to that. And I want to thank you both for these conversations because I'm like, yeah, people who like there's this notion that folks who live in, say, a shelter shouldn't have a beautiful space, or you just need to kind of get through it or something like that. And you're like, how do you expect someone to have a balanced, healthy life if you're not giving them a healthy environment to launch from? And I don't want to say, I'm using the shelters as an example. I don't want to take away from any of the good work folks are doing. But I just think we need to keep coming back to that as a community. Like, I think at the end of the day, we want healthy, balanced environments that support people. And that can be as fundamental as how we help people transition through harder parts in their lives and the systems we use. Paul, Emily and I traditionally do a toast at the end of the show. Would you like to do a toast today for us? The first in our history.
I am going to take it from what you said because I think you said something very powerful. I feel like we are a bit out of harmony, we are a bit out of balance, and we are not as connected. So I want to toast to interconnection, to the forest, to the fawn in Emily's backyard, to the animals, and to all the people, because we are all connected and rely on each other. That's my toast.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul, for joining us today. Thank you, Emily Kornheiser, for joining us today. Emily, if people want to contact you, how should they do that?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, and there you'll find my email addresses, my phone number, links to all of my social media accounts, and regular updates on places you can find me in real life.
And Paul, if folks want to find more information on your organization.
cboeo.org.
Perfect. The Montpelier Happy Hour will return next week on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, at 2 o'clock on Friday. In the meantime, you can find us at our Facebook page or the Montpelier Happy Hour.captivate.fm or on iTunes or BCTV. Have a great weekend, everybody.